behalf of the Lincoln Heritage Committee of DeWitt County, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the tonight's event. It is my pleasure and honor to present our speaker. So you know his name if you don't know him. This is John Warner, the fourth.
All right, last time I checked.
Born and raised here in Clinton, and as you know, his family name is all over the town, so he has an extensive knowledge of the town, its history, and is going to share a lot of those stories with us tonight.
Well, Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. It's really a treat to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. Let me start with a little bit of show and tell. The Moore and Warner Farm Management Office was initially my great-great-great-grandfather's law office, and you're going to hear more about that. And as we were, and Lincoln practiced out of that office, and as we were remodeling and revamping that office and going through the old files, we found this handwritten document in Lincoln's hand. And this is a promissory note. Now, in the old days, attorneys could lend money, and it was on the basis of a legal case and a settlement. And let's say you had a case and your attorney had appeared in court and you'd won and $500 was coming to you. And you're there in your attorney's office talking it over saying, yeah, good, we won and the money's coming in, and you say to your attorney, yeah, but I really need $100 right now. Well, the attorney says, okay, on the basis of that settlement coming in, we can loan you $100 and you'd agree on a going rate of interest. And understand, when the $500 settlement finally comes into our office, you're going to get your settlement less the $100 and less whatever interest is paid. So this was, it's no longer, attorneys can't do this anymore, but in those days they could. So here's a document that I'm going to pass it around. Please be careful with it. It's not exotically framed. Clinton, March 10th, 1859, $100, 6 months after date, I promise to pay A. Lincoln $100 value received, and it is signed by D.C. Jones. So Lincoln wrote out this loan document, and Mr. Jones signed it. And with that, there was a loan on the books, and as I say, we found it here in the file. So as it goes around the room, you're basically holding a Lincoln document in your hands. Well, here we are in the Vespasian Warner Library, and who better to tell these stories than Vespasian? So we're just going to let him do the talking this evening. Let me read to you some speeches. He gave a speech in 1924. At that point, he was 82 years old. He died the following year, so he's really, near the end of his life. And then there's some other letters that we found from the early 1900s when he's discussing Lincoln and so forth. You all have seen this photo. Here's Vespasian. Of course, my dad was alive when Vespasian was still around. And my dad described him as a jovial, white-haired guy with a handlebar mustache. Well, white-haired guy with a handlebar mustache. So there's Vespasian. In 1924, he was invited to address the DeWitt County Bar Association. Now, Vespasian is an attorney. At this point, he's retired. But court's in session, the Bar Association is having a dinner, and so sort of the elder statesman of the DeWitt County Bar has been invited to talk to the other attorneys. So I'll read you the speech, and from time to time I'm going to make an aside to explain some of the things that he says. But he's talking about seeing Lincoln and the early days of the DeWitt County Bar. Well, comrades, I think this is a magnificent start you're making today. Now you notice he says comrades. One attorney talking to another group of attorneys. So they all know each other. You quarrel and fight for each other. You quarrel and fight each other for your clients in the courts, But as soon as you are through with the lawsuit, you ought to be the very best of friends, and I think that you are. It's lucky for you that I have not prepared an address or thought of what I would say. I know that you've adjourned court only for dinner, so I suppose I will not be allowed over 10 or 15 minutes to address you. So this is just off the cuff, just talking off the top of his head. And you know, over the years I've read this speech aloud to some friends of mine, and several times they've said to me, gee, he sounds like you. But, you know, every family has colloquialisms and means of expression and favorite phrases. So in that regard, he doesn't sound like me. Maybe I sound like him. Anyway, as I have it and remember it, the first circuit court that was ever held in DeWitt County was in 1839. Now think of Clinton in 1839. Maybe the size of Hallsville, maybe, you know, cow paths, dirt trails. I mean, my dad talked about being a kid when Kid Warner lived in the big brick house on the north side of the green space here, what used to be the Art Center. And my dad said as a kid you could look out the back windows of the Art Center and see the cemetery, because that was the northern edge of town and there was nothing else out there. So, okay, 1839, a few houses, cow paths, dirt trails, just you know. So here's the start of law. There was not a licensed attorney in the county at that time, and there wasn't one until 1842, when Clifton H. Moore came from Pekin and located here, and he was the only resident attorney for a number of years after that time. So the first attorney to live here is in 1842, and Vespasian is saying there weren't other resident attorneys. That's why these guys are riding the circuit and going from county seat to county seat to county seat, representing clients and trying cases. There's just not enough business for a lot of attorneys to live in any one location, and they're just going all over the place. In the olden times, the lawyers traveled with judges around the circuit on horseback or in buggies, and they had no reports, they had no books of forms, they had to rely upon themselves instead of following the law as laid down by the Supreme and other courts. They were making laws for the courts thereafter. Now this is a real important point with Vespasian, and you're going to find he's interested in these guys. He sees these attorneys when he's a young man. He thinks they're cool. He wants to be one, and he grows up to become an attorney. And the perception of attorneys and the law was so different in those days. Again, we're talking the frontier. We're absolutely on the edge of the known world. And people are settling here. They want to have good schools. They want law and order. They want to be able to get married and have their marriages recognized in a court of law. They want to raise children. They want to build a house and have their property protected. And so these attorneys are making the laws that are going to make this community work. So it's different than what we think of nowadays. And as I say, Vespasian is really inspired by these guys. They were making laws for the courts thereafter. They carried their own stationery. The majority of them were compelled to write with goose quills. They couldn't afford steel pens, and they carried their papers in plug hats on their heads. Now we've referred to those top hats as stovepipe hats. And in 2 or 3 different letters of Vespasian's, he refers to them as plug hats. So that must have been a nickname from those days. So they carried their papers in plug hats on their heads. I have seen Mr. Lincoln do that. They also carried their stationery that way. So, you know, you'd roll it up and tuck it in the hat. You know, on your head, where you go. The first time I ever saw Mr. Lincoln to know who he was when I was a boy, about 15 or 16 years old, and Mr. Barnett kept a tavern south of the square, and we lived just across the street where Mr. Nixon now lives. Now the Barnett Tavern was about where Joe Taylor's office is located now. So if Vespasian's living across the street, he's about where the parking lot for the funeral home is now. The attorneys are on the way to Barnett Tavern. That's where they're going to spend the night. They don't live here. That's the place where you get a meal and find a bed. Court adjourned for dinner. Foreign attorneys, meaning not from town, foreign attorneys were about all there were, and they were going down to the Barnett Tavern, as they called it, for their dinner. I saw a tall, ungainly man in a frock coat and linen pants, wearing a stovepipe hat, his hands behind his back, and he was walking between two immaculately attired attorneys, one on each side of him, looking up into his face. His coat sleeves appeared too short, and his pant legs didn't quite reach his shoe tops. His whole appearance was awkward and uncouth, but his companions seemed eagerly attentive to whatever it was he was saying. I wondered what those gentlemen saw in that fellow to pay any attention to him, and it turned out to be Abraham Lincoln, who was then practicing here. It's wonderful what this county has seen and helped to produce. And think of that description. Kind of shaggy looking, coat sleeves are too short, trousers are short. The other two he refers to as gentlemen. Those two gentlemen talking to that fellow. They're immaculately attired. Lincoln is looking kind of ragged, but they still are very interested in everything that he has to say. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, two men who became widely known throughout the world, tried lawsuits in this DeWitt County Circuit Court and tried them against each other. David Davis was a judge later. I'm only speaking of those I knew, and it is remarkable how Mr. Davis recognized Abraham Lincoln even at that time. Abraham Lincoln at that time had no greater reputation than any of you gentlemen here. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky of poor white parents. In those days, there were three classes of people in the South: the slaveholders, the slave, and the poor white trash. Judge Davis was a blue-blooded Marylander belonging to the slaveholding class, and Mr. Lincoln was a descendant of the poor white trash. And in traveling the circuit, as they did on horseback and in buggies, Judge Davis and Mr. Lincoln always rode together. Judge Davis stuck to it. He appreciated it. Judge Davis told Mr. Moore in my presence this thing about Mr. Lincoln. In those days, there was a doctor here by the name of Wynn. He had a great reputation. He was a pill bag doctor, and a man who became sick and didn't call in Dr. Wynn, if he died, they considered it a case of suicide. So Dr. Wynn must have been good. There was a man by the name of Hutchin, west of town, near where now is Kenny, who owned a farm and was pretty well fixed. He got into a lawsuit in the court with Dr. Wynn. Mr. Lincoln was not in the case, but he heard it, and it was a bitter fight, and Mr. Hutchin got a judgment against Dr. Wynn for $150. Well, that would have bought a quarter section of land in those days. It was a big pile of money. Now let's put that in modern terms. $150 for 160 acres. Now it's $10,000 for an acre. So now we're talking $1.6 million for 160 acres. So in those days, as Vespasian said, this was a big pile of money. Big lawsuit. A lawsuit in those days made a feud for life between the parties to it. Down in Mount Pulaski, where they were holding the next term of court, they heard that Mr. Hutchin was sick and that Dr. Wynn was his attending physician. And Mr. Lincoln thought that was a joke. In driving up from Mount Pulaski to Clinton to open court, Judge Davis and Mr. Lincoln were driving a team, and they saw Dr. Wynn coming down the road on horseback. And when they met, Mr. Lincoln stopped the team, and Dr. Wynn said, "How do you do, Mr. Davis?" And "How do you do, Mr. Lincoln?" And they replied saying, "How do you do, Dr. Wynn?" And Mr. Lincoln said, "I understand our old friend Mr. Hutchin is sick." And the doctor replied, "Yes, he's sick." Mr. Lincoln asked, "Who was attending him?" And Dr. Wynn replied, "I'm attending him." Mr. Lincoln inquired, "Is he very sick?" And Dr. Wynn said, "Yes, he is quite sick." Mr. Lincoln further inquired, "Do you think he will recover?" And Dr. Wynn replied, "Yes, I think he will get well." "Well, doctor," asked Mr. Lincoln, "about how long do you think it will take before he gets out?" The doctor had hold of his reins with his left hand, and he put up his right hand and scratched his head and said, "Oh, about the time that judgment is paid off." And Judge Davis said you could have heard Lincoln laugh a half-mile away. It is strange how the attorneys in those days succeeded. They couldn't carry any books, and they traveled from county seat to county seat and tried what cases they could. And you would think it was pretty tough if you had to originate your own declarations, bills in chancery, motions, instructions to the jury, and so on, without a single book to refer to give you an example. But that's the way it was in those days. Again, frontier, cow paths between these villages and towns. You know, the courthouse was a log structure. You know, flies and fleas all over the place. We had some good lawyers. Lawrence Weldon was one of the first men that came. Now, Lawrence Weldon, Weldon Springs, the community of Weldon. Mr. Weldon recognized what there was in Mr. Lincoln. To show that, he named his first son, Lincoln H. Weldon, after Mr. Lincoln. I remember this incident myself. I was reading law in Mr. Weldon's office, and Judge Douglas was billed to address a political meeting, Democratic, here in Clinton. Mr. Weldon wrote down to Springfield, telling Mr. Lincoln of it, and telling him he'd better come up and hear what Judge Douglas said. The people came into town in their wagons, and they erected a platform right west of town where the roads were. So think of Routes 10 and 54, and Baum's and Douglas's. Somewhere right out in there is where a platform was erected, and Stephen A. Douglas is giving a speech. Okay, so they erect this platform right west of town where the road's for the speaker, and there was a big crowd there. Now, you know, same thing with the courts as this. When court was in session, the town was small. There wasn't a telegraph. There weren't trains yet. Terms of court were big events. People dressed up, came to town, brought lunch, sat in the court and listened to the cases being argued. They latched on to the good phrases. The arguments were discussed and talked about afterwards. You know, I might be saying to somebody else, "And did you hear when Lincoln said such and such? Boy, can't that guy turn a phrase?" And this was something that people really took in and enjoyed. And as I say, remember. So again, think of people coming to town on horseback and in wagons to hear these people speak. Judge Douglas was there, and a lot of people were on the platform, and he got up and he was addressing the crowd, and he'd not been talking long when Mr. Lincoln arrived in a buggy from Springfield. He got up on the platform behind Judge Douglas, and Douglas didn't know he was there. Douglas, knowing that almost a majority of the people were from the South, accused Mr. Lincoln of being in favor of Negro equality, and he went on in that way. When he finished, they cheered him. And then the people out in the crowd began to yell for Lincoln. Lincoln! He arose, and Judge Douglas turned and looked at him. And the two men looked at each other. Now imagine, you're delivering a political speech, and your opponent comes up there behind you, and you don't even know he's there. So they're both, kind of figuring out now what. Mr. Lincoln faced the crowd and said that that was Judge Douglas's meeting, and that he, Lincoln, had no right to speak there, but if they wanted to hear him, if they would appear in the courthouse square at early candlelight, he would talk to them, and the meeting then adjourned. Now, I mentioned this last week. I've always loved that phrase, early candlelight. So it's dusk. And about where the statue is on the square, okay, think of that as the place where the platform is erected. Now, on the one hand, Lincoln is showing courtesy and professionalism when he stands up and says, "This is Judge Douglas's meeting, I shouldn't be speaking here." On the other hand, he's got the rest of the afternoon and the early evening to think about how he wants to respond. So he's being pretty sharp about this. And that night, they put up a platform of dry goods boxes on the north side of the courthouse, got some torches, And Mr. Lincoln got up and in talking to them said that Judge Douglas accused him of being in favor of Negro equality. He said he wasn't in favor of Negro equality to the extent that Judge Douglas would have them believe, but that he did believe that the colored man had as much right to eat the bread earned by the sweat of his own face as Judge Douglas or any other living man. And that was the thing that really caused the general debate between Lincoln and Douglas in the state of Illinois. Now this is when Lincoln utters that phrase, "You can fool some of the people some of the time." And he's saying, now Judge Douglas is saying all these things about me, and Judge Douglas is saying I'm in favor of Negro equality. Now some of you are going to fall for this, but folks, I'm not as in favor of that as you might think. But I do think the Negro has as much right to eat the bread earned by his own labor as anybody else does. And so that kind of sets the tone. Now, you got to remember, Vespasian is talking to the Bar Association. So he kind of changes subject. And he says, I don't know, but what I might tell you a little of my own experience in law. I was reading law in Mr. Weldon's office, and I had been reading there about 3 months when the Civil War broke out. Now, in the olden days, if you were near a law school, you could attend law school. If you were in a part of the country where law schools were remote, you could go to it was like being interviewed for a job. You had to persuade the licensed attorney to take you in, but you went into another law office and you read law in that office. You read the law books, you read the commentaries, you learned how to fill out the forms, how to write declarations, how to prepare the arguments and so forth that the attorney would use. And when you had finally demonstrated to the attorney a certain facility with your knowledge, then the attorney would write a letter of endorsement, and you could sit for the bar exam. So this is how Lincoln was admitted. You know, you read all these stories about Lincoln reading law books out in a plowed field. Well, he's reading the law. And so this is what Vespasian is doing. He wants to be an attorney. The best attorney at the time, beyond C.H. Moore, is probably Lawrence Weldon. And so he is in Lawrence Weldon's office reading law. And I had been reading there about 3 months when the Civil War broke out. I was not quite 19. I volunteered as a private, went in, served through the war, and when it was over, I was discharged. And then President Lincoln appointed me a captain in the Army. I accepted, of course, and I was ordered west. The Sioux and the Cheyenne Indians had broken out on the plains, and I was ordered out there, and I mixed in with them for a couple of years when I realized that I would have to remain in the Army all my life, or resign and come home and prepare for civil life. I decided I would resign. Now, what he doesn't say is he enlists as a private soldier. He's pretty quickly promoted to sergeant and then lieutenant, and this is during the Civil War. And then he is appointed brevet captain, so he gets the rank of captain, and brevet means you're holding this rank during the duration of the war. It doesn't mean that this is a rank that's going to be on your official military records, but you're holding this rank. So he's brevet captain, is doing such a good job that by the time the war ends, he is brevet major. The war ends, he goes back to the rank that he had earned. He goes back to being a lieutenant. So then he gets this appointment from Washington. No, we're going to bump you up again. You were good. We're going to bump you up again. He's a captain. He goes out west. As he said, he mixes in with the Indians for a couple of years and realizes that he's going to have to do something besides stay in the service. I sent my resignation to Washington, and it was accepted, and I decided to go straight to Harvard University and go through the law department of that institution and make up for the lost time. I'd never been east of Ohio, except in Georgia and Tennessee. Now, again, this is like me saying, I was in Saigon once. Well, those of you who are old enough are going to know, oh, Vietnam War. When he says to the audience, I've never been east of Ohio, except in Georgia and Tennessee, those in the audience, those attorneys in the audience who are old enough are going to say, oh, yeah, Vicksburg, March to the Sea. Oh, yeah. This is going to resonate with them in a way that maybe it doesn't with us. And I started direct to Boston. I had an old uniform on that was in bad shape, and I had not worn a collar for 6 years. I got to St. Louis and went into a clothing store and bought what I thought was a #1 suit of clothes. High-heeled, stub-toed boots, yellow trousers, red vest, yellow coat, red necktie, and a big slouch hat. Now that's one of the high crown and a low brim. I thought I was right up to snuff. I went through and got to Boston, stopped at the Parker House, and they told me how to get out to the university. And I've always liked this line. I went out and told them my story, and they let me in. Now here again, he's 26 years old. He comes into Harvard Law and says, I'm a Union Army veteran. I started as a private soldier. By the time I finished, I was brevet major. Then I was appointed captain in the regular army and sent out west. They can tell this guy's got some backbone and that he's going to go someplace in life. So I told them my story and they let me in. And I never saw such sights in my life as those students were. They wore low-heeled shoes, bobtailed coats, big neckties and so forth, and some wore glasses and even carried canes. Why, if they had dressed that way where I had been just 2 weeks before, they would have been shot on sight. And I felt like smashing them. They would not speak to me and left me severely alone. It went along 8 or 10 days when I discovered that I was the fellow that was off. I saw them looking at me, so I went up to some of the boys and asked them who was the best tailor in Boston, and they told me. So I went over and went in and asked what they would charge for a first-class, up-to-date suit of clothes, and they told me. So I asked, when will you have it ready to try on? And they said the next Tuesday morning. They took my measurements, and I started to the door and said, I'll be here on Tuesday morning to try it on. They said, hold on, you haven't told us the style of the suit, you haven't selected the cloth. I said, no, I haven't, and I don't think I will either. I selected what I have on. Again, he's got to be a pretty big-spirited guy to be stand up in front of the crowd and talk about a time when he really did something dumb. They thought I was right about it. After I got dressed like a white man and got acquainted with the boys, they told me that when I broke in there, I was the greatest curiosity they had ever seen. They didn't know whether I was a 3-card Monte man or a horse thief. Now, 3-card Monte is the shell game, so they can't tell who this guy is. I graduated from Harvard and came home and was admitted to the bar, and I'd not been in the courtroom in 7 years. I was admitted to the bar and commenced to practice law, and some man was foolish enough to employ me as his attorney in a lawsuit in the circuit court. There was a lawyer here in those days by the name of Palmer, who was a holy terror to the young men particularly. Now, in another book of DeWitt County history, there's some descriptions of Palmer, and apparently the guy was out in left field. And he was a licensed attorney, would engage in any kind of behavior. It was not uncommon for him to scream at the jury, just a wild man. And finally, a few years later, he was disbarred. So here's young Vespasian, and he's going up against the craziest guy that you could have walk into the courtroom. He was on the other side. Well, I thought my entire future depended upon the result of that lawsuit, and I was afraid if Palmer took hold of me, I would be ruined. So I went to Mr. Weldon and asked him to come into the case with me. He wouldn't do it. He said, you've got to try it alone. When the case was called, I looked around, and there sat Weldon among the lawyers, and I knew he would help me in case it became necessary. Well, I tried the case, and as luck would have it, I won out. Then Mr. Weldon came up to me afterwards and said, don't you see that it was best that I forced you to try that case alone? If I had gone in with you on this one, I would have had to go in with you on every case you had in the future. So he's actually trying to help Vespasian get his feet on the ground. So I presume some of you young men have been in the same shape and that you thought your whole future depended on the result of your first trial. And this is where he concludes. Now that's all I have to say today. I've talked 15 or 20 minutes, and that is all the time I should use. So anyway, there's his first accounts of seeing Lincoln. And my dad always said that when Vespasian was 15 or 16, and incidentally, he didn't go by Vespasian, his nickname was Pash, kind of the middle part of Vespasian, that as a young man, he would slip into the courtroom and sit in the back of the courtroom just to hear these guys arguing cases. And now here's a letter that was written March 24th, 1908, to a reporter from the Chicago Record-Herald. My dear Mr. Likelight, I have your wire of yesterday saying, kindly recall conversation on train, Clinton to Chicago, last July, about Lincoln and others, to settle wager. Did Lincoln, to your knowledge, take an occasional drink? And in reply, I remember our conversation distinctly, and the story I told you about Lincoln was substantially in brief as follows. Now, historians have wondered about this for years and years and years. Did he drink? My father lived in the little town of Clinton, just across the street from what was then known as the Barnett Tavern. Now, this is a lot like what he says in the speech, at which the judge and non-resident attorneys attending court in that town stopped while there. That was in the early day when the town was small and did not have a railroad or telegraph, and the terms of the circuit court were important events. So here he is saying it again. A little bitty burg, when the court's in session, this is big news. At that time, Judge David Davis was the judge of the circuit court for that district. Ward H. Lamont was the prosecuting attorney for that district, and Mr. Lincoln and several other prominent non-resident attorneys attended the sessions of that court and stopped at the Barnett Tavern. Being young and courteous, I would hang around the tavern in the evening as long as my parents would allow me to remain out of bed, to hear the judge and lawyers, great men in my eyes at that time, and great men then and afterwards, in fact, talk. One evening after supper, Judge Davis, Mr. Lincoln, and Mr. Lamont were sitting out on the platform in front of the tavern, and I was listening and catching every word they said. Finally, Mr. Lamont said to the judge, "Judge, let me go uptown and get some whiskey, and we'll go up in my room and talk." Judge Davis, in his peculiar tone of voice that will be remembered by those who knew him, impressively said, "I won't do it. I won't do it. If I do it, you will get drunk." Mr. Lamont begged to be allowed to go for the whiskey and assured the judge that he would not get drunk if he allowed him to get it. And the judge replied, "I know you will. I know you will. You got drunk at Mount Pulaski last week, and I had to adjourn the court all afternoon to let you get sober enough to attend your business." Mr. Lamont insisted on being allowed to go for the whiskey and promised faithfully that he would not abuse the privilege. And finally, Mr. Lincoln straightened back in the chair, clasped his hands up over his head, and said, "Oh, Judge, let's give him just one more chance." And the judge said, "All right, but I know what will come of it." And Mr. Lamont went up to a small grocery near there and directly came back with a small white pitcher in his hand, which I assumed contained whiskey. And the three got up and went in the hotel, closing the door behind them, and then in quotation marks, and these are his quotes, "and the subsequent proceedings interested me no more." In other words, there they went, and I went home, and that was the end of that. That is the story in brief as I told it to you, and it is absolutely correct. I have no personal knowledge as to whether Mr. Lincoln ever did or did not take an occasional drink, but I do not wonder that you inferred from the story as I told it to you that he did. I did not intend to convey the idea that Mr. Lincoln ever drank, but I do know that some of Mr. Lincoln's most trusted men, Mr. Lamont among others, at that time indulged in the use of intoxicating liquors. And Mr. Lincoln took Mr. Lamont to Washington with him and made him Marshal of the District of Columbia, an important position during those times. See, people are wondering, did he drink? Did he associate with people that drank? So on and so forth. So Vespasian is going to great pains to say, I didn't mean to suggest that Lincoln drank. And I don't mean to suggest that he was any too judgmental about people that did drink. Because he worked with Ward Lamont for years, and even though Ward Lamont got drunk frequently, when Lincoln went to Washington, Lamont went and Lincoln gave him a big important position. So he's trying to really explain that. Now, then, he gave an interview in 1923, and he brings up some other topics. And this first one is again about drinking. Mr. Lincoln did not drink, although it was almost the universal custom among men in public life of that day. There's an amusing story about Ward Lamon in later years. After Lincoln became president, he appointed Lamon Marshal of the District of Columbia. A certain individual of more or less dangerous reputation made threats against the Marshal's life. One day, the two met on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, and the threatener made a move toward his hip pocket. Lamon struck him a terrific blow under the jaw and actually broke the fellow's neck, killing him instantly. In a panic, Lamon sought the president, told him the circumstances, and begged for protection. Mr. Lincoln looked grave. "Well, Ward," he said at last, "I'll stand by you. But hereafter, when you have occasion to hit a man, don't use your fist, get a club." Here's another little tidbit. Mr. Lincoln was at one time attorney for the Illinois Central in several counties. There was a case in Judge Davis's court in Clinton wherein the Illinois Central Railroad was being sued on some count or another. When the case was called, Mr. Lincoln rose and asked for a continuance for one day. He said, "One of our witnesses is the chief engineer of the railroad. His name is George B. McClellan. He can't be here until tomorrow. Further deponent saith not." And Judge Davis granted the continuance. The following day, there met for the first time these two men, one of whom was to be President of the United States and the other Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Potomac, all in the short space of a half a dozen years. So, George McClellan, Abraham Lincoln, right here in Clinton, this is where they first meet. Again, when Vespasian says it's wonderful what this county has seen and helped to produce. Let's see, I've got just one more here. There was a man named Robert Lewis in Clinton who discovered a deed to some land in the Missouri Ozarks among his father's papers after his father's death. Lewis decided to locate on his Ozark farm and went there to find it. The story goes that he found a log cabin on the property occupied by an old man, some dogs, and a squirrel rifle. "Who owns this place?" Lewis asked. "I do," said the squatter. Lewis produced his deed and suggested that there might be a legal question involved. Whereupon the old gent took down his rifle from its pegs and said, "Well, here's my title, now you get it." Lewis returned to Clinton saying that he bowed to the squatter's proof of title. That's kind of the preamble to the story. After the Civil War, some men from DeWitt County, Illinois, bought a quantity of cotton at Memphis, and while the civil authorities consented to its being shipped north, the military rules would not permit its shipment. Lawrence Weldon of Clinton, a friend of Mr. Lincoln, was sent to Washington to obtain a presidential order rescinding that rule. So they're trying to get the cotton shipped up here from the south. And the civil authorities say, yeah, you can do it. And the military authorities say, no, you're not sending civilian stuff on military rail. No. So they send Lawrence Weldon, longtime friend, attorney, go to Washington and talk to the president. You can convince him to do this. So the president listens to Weldon's plea. His face began lighting up and he said, "What's become of our old friend Bob Lewis of DeWitt County? Do you remember the story that Bob used to tell about his going to Missouri to look up some Mormon lands that belonged to his father? Well, Bob had the civil rights, but the militia had proof of title. This seems to be a similar case." So the cotton never came north. And that was his way of saying, just as Bob Lewis went down and said, "I think I own this stuff," and the squatter said, "Well, here's my rifle, get off the property," Lincoln is saying, well, you can say that the civil authorities are going to agree to this, but the military authorities aren't, and they've got the guns, so I guess you guys aren't bringing the cotton. That's about it in terms of the speeches and the letters. How are we doing on time? Let me quick tell you a little bit about the office itself. The office that you all see as Moore and Warner Farm Management was Clifton H. Moore's law office. It's the first brick office building built in town. It was built in 1856. And as Vespasian says, there wasn't a licensed attorney in the county until 1842, when Clifton H. Moore came from Pekin. So he's here in town, he's practicing for 14 years before he's got the capital to build this brick building. He's practicing, he's in that office. When Lincoln is riding the circuit, Lincoln is practicing out of that office. Now we can confirm from things we found in the office and from court cases that this was in 1856 through 1858, and that's why we put that plaque on the south side of the building. As it turns out, Lincoln was practicing out of that office in 1859 as well, but we didn't know it when we did the plaque, and so anyway, 1856 to 1859. David Davis was there, Stephen A. Douglas was there, Ward Lamont was there, Lawrence Weldon was there, Leonard Swett was there. All of these big names were all in and out of that office. You know, those floors echoed to their footfalls and the sound of their voices and the sound of their laughter, and it's public business. We're open from 8:30 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. We renovated the building a few years ago, but really tried to do it in keeping with the period and the history. And if anytime you want to come in and just look around, you're more than welcome to. And it's, honest to goodness, a building where Lincoln practiced. Vespasian married C.H. Moore's daughter. And at that point, Vespasian was a licensed attorney. And you know, this makes all kinds of sense. Son-in-law went to work with father-in-law. So there are these two attorneys in the office. And when C.H. was there by himself, it was C.H. Moore, attorney. When Vespasian Warner went to work with him, it became Moore and Warner, attorneys. That's where we got the name for the farm management business. You know, at the time we started the business, I thought, well, it used to belong to C.H. Moore, and then it came down through the family to the Warner side of the family, and I bought it out of the estate, so it's always been a Moore or a Warner, and gee, it used to be Moore and Warner attorneys. Why don't we just kind of as a tip of the hat to those guys and those times, name it Moore and Warner attorneys? That's where that all came from. Let me see, what else can I tell you? If you're interested in reading any more about this stuff, I really recommend Helen Stein's book. I really recommend this. It's well written. It covers the time period and the cases. You can get copies of this up at the museum. Where else is it, Helen?
Online.
Okay, you can get it online. This is a really good little book. And you know, it's a good read, and it all fits. You know the geography and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure if the library has a copy of this. Morris Porter was a resident here in Clinton, and in 1960 he wrote his thesis for his Juris Doctor's degree, his graduate degree in law. And his thesis is Portrait of a Prairie Lawyer. And he went into the Moore estate in those days, because we had all those records and all the correspondence and everything, and went through the correspondence and picked out the cases and figured out the case load and so on and so forth. Anyway, you can get this from the University of Illinois, and is it here? Joan, do you have a copy?
I tracked it down. Somebody was looking for it today, and I finally found it.
Okay, so you can get it here. You know, he's primarily talking about the early law practice, but he gives really good vignettes of Lincoln in town, David Davis, Stephen A. Douglas, all of those names. You know, you kind of go through 4 or 5 pages of pretty dry reading about the cases, and then you hit 2 or 3 pages that are just fascinating about people coming in and out of town. So that's another good one to read. And then the last thing, I don't know how many of you have seen these. These two books that Bob Shaw did, Abraham Lincoln Traveled This Way and Lincoln in Gettysburg. These have come out in the last 2 or 3 years. When I was in the banking business, Bob was a customer of ours, and I used to wait on him a lot. He's a good guy. And of course, he's a photographer of some recognition and renown. And a couple of years ago, he came into the office and he was thinking about doing a book of the world of Illinois as it looked in Lincoln's time. And you know, you were saying, I figured out how I could take the shots and take them at angles where I could take period buildings and not have telephone wires, or I can Photoshop them and clean some of that stuff up. And I was wondering if I could take some pictures here in the office because of Lincoln being here in the office. Well, you know, it was easy to say, sure, yeah, no problem. So we're sitting there talking about it. And of course, I'm thinking like a business guy, I guess. And the first thing that went through my mind was, how do we make this marketable all across the nation? And so then we began talking about, gee, there are sites all across the nation that Lincoln visited while he was campaigning, when he was president, so on and so forth. And wouldn't it be even better to do something like that? So we kind of talked about that for a while, and we agreed that Bob was going to take some pictures in the office. And then, he called about a week later and said, you know, I've been thinking about it, and my wife and I have been talking about it, and she doesn't mind if I travel. I think we really do need to make this a book that is a national scope. And so the whole theme began to grow. So he's traveling the country. He's in the East and you know, Southern Illinois, Tennessee, Kentucky. And he's emailing photos to me, and I mean, they're just breathtaking. You know, one thing is kind of leading to another, and oh, I heard about this, and I've got to go photograph that, and so on. And then we got the idea that, and he called one day and said, hey, what would you think? And you know, it kind of, again, I talked about it with my wife, what would you think of using quotations from Lincoln? And we went, yeah, that makes sense. And maybe we can use original documents so that we can show his handwriting. And yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you know, it's almost like making a cake. It's kind of, well, let's put some of this in, let's put some of that in. And then, a couple of months later, he said, you know, I really think this is turning into much more than just a coffee table book. This is going to turn into credible history. I really think I need a narrative, and a credible narrative. And, you know, I found myself sitting there with him saying, Bob, I've just been thinking the same thing. Well, there's this generation's Lincoln scholar is a man named Michael Burlingame. He teaches in Connecticut, and he teaches at the Springfield campus of the University of Illinois. And Bob had done some photography, some Lincoln photography for the Presidential Library over in Springfield, and got to know Professor Burlingame. Well, Burlingame has just published, within the last 5 years, the definitive 2-volume history of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he gave me a copy of it, and I've read it, but yeah, it's you know, there's a lot there. Anyway, he approached Burlingame, and Professor Burlingame said, sure, I'd be glad to write the narrative. In fact, they used a lot of narrative from his 2-volume history. And so, in this one especially, Abraham Lincoln Traveled This Way, you will see photos from here in this part of the world of sites, locations, buildings, and so forth, with which you're very familiar, because you've driven past them all your lives. And then you will find a narrative from Burlingame that puts things into historical perspective, and also quotations of Lincoln's that kind of pertain to that. You kind of get 3 voices. Under each photograph, of course, are the narrative, the descriptions from the photographer. And over here is some kind of writing in Lincoln's hand. And then the gray shaded areas, you get Burlingame's historical narrative. And it is designed to be something that you can open it to just about any page and find something of interest, and so on and so forth. Here, folks. Maybe this looks familiar to you. So this is one of the pictures that he took. Well, the interesting thing about this, as we were going along, and Bob didn't know anything about this, and I didn't know anything about it, all across the country, scholars had been collecting every known handwritten Lincoln document that's still around, every one of them except the one that we had in our office, and they were scanning them into some sort of word processing program. And the computer was memorizing Lincoln's handwriting. And now you can type anything. Mary had a little lamb. Hit print, and it comes out in his handwriting. And so you can do this with anybody, George Washington, anybody. So, Bob was anticipating having to negotiate and get releases and pay the insurance for photographing these fragile original documents. Well, it made this whole book just turn a corner, because all of a sudden you didn't have to do any of that. You could choose the quotations you wanted to use. You could type them out. You could use this program, and there was the document that you wanted to have. So that just made an enormous difference. These are available out at the museum. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them at Barnes & Noble, both in Bloomington and off the website. If you're at all interested, I recommend them to you. They're good history. It was fun being involved with the book, and we both have the sense that this is adding to Lincoln history, that it's credible. It's like Helen's book. It's well written and it's credible history, and it adds to the scholarship. And we're hoping that 40 years from now, people will still want to turn to these and look. Well, now I feel like Vespasian. I've been up here long enough, and I've said about all I should say. And so thank you all very much. If you have any questions or anything else I can tell you about, I'll try to answer. So, thank you. Well, I guess I said it all. Okay, you know how to turn that off?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, I do. But are we ready to turn it off?
Apparently not. Yes, no? Yeah.
Is there some place you can go on the internet and pick up like the high points that you brought out tonight?
Yes, if you go to the C.H. Moore Museum, a lot of this material is on their website. And then if you cross over they've got a link that goes to Moore & Warner Farm Management's website. We've got a lot of that material there. I left some of these speeches with Joan here in the library, and you might be able to persuade her to shoot some copies for you.
Yeah, we just, John brought them over to me after he gave a similar talk to the staff last week. We now have a vertical file with copies of all the speeches that John read from tonight that you can check out and have your own copies of it.
Anything else? Well, yes, thank you.
I'm particularly interested in some of the square history,
Mm-hmm.
and I know in the, after John Warner died,
Mm-hmm.
that it mentions that he owned several buildings on the square.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know which ones those were?
No,
I would assume he owned the bank.
he owned the bank, and that started as John Warner and Company. That was, we used to think of it as the John Warner Bank. Started as John Warner and Company. Again, you're on the frontier. It was an investment house primarily. People on the East Coast, people in Chicago wanting to buy land. Well, John Warner and Company would identify a tract that was for sale, would work with a local attorney, do the legal work, write up the contract. Of course, in those days, this is right after the Civil War, most states were issuing their own currency, and so you had to make sure that whatever the payment was going to be in something that actually had some value. And it wasn't until 1912 that John Warner and Company was reincorporated as a state bank, and then it became the John Warner Bank. No, I don't know. He had a financial interest in the McGill Hotel. I know that. You know, those years that I was trustee of the estate, of the Moore estate, I was so wound up with that stuff that I can tell you all the buildings the Moore estate owned, but what John Warner and,
I assume the Ohio, because he and Lintner built that building.
you may be right, you know more about it than I do.
Okay, I didn't know what other buildings, I knew some of the ones that Moore owned.
Yeah, yeah, and they were kind of dotted around here.
Yeah.
So,
The,
My question is not in regard to Lincoln,
mhm.
but there was a Seth Warner that was part of the Green Mountain Boys.
Right.
Was that an ancestor of yours?
Some kind of distant relation. But primarily the Warner family came from Virginia. Actually, it was Virginia and somewhat up into New England. But
This
some
was in
came-
Vermont.
Right, this was in Vermont.
Right.
But that's, yeah, I've always grown up being told that he was a way distant relative. A cousin of a cousin of a cousin or something. Anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you.